She smiled in public. But her secret changed everything. If you enjoy emotional stories filled with unforgettable characters and powerful life lessons, subscribe to our channel and become part of our growing family. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know which part of America or the world you call home. Now let's begin today's story. She smiled in public. But her secret changed everything. Maya Bennett didn't know that yet, not really. Not in the way you know something in your bones. All she knew, standing at the marble island of the Cross family's Charleston kitchen with a paring knife in one hand and a bowl of cherry tomatoes in the other, was that Vanessa Hale had walked in wearing that smile. The one she wore for cameras, for guests, for anyone who might matter. It was not the smile she wore for the help. "I need you to keep your mouth shut," Vanessa said quietly, stepping close enough that her perfume, something sharp and expensive, cut through the smell of basil and garlic. "About what you think you heard last night." Maya set the knife down. Her hands were steady, though her heart wasn't. "I don't know what you're talking about, Miss Hale." "Don't." Vanessa's voice stayed low, pleasant, the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years learning how to sound harmless. "Don't do the innocent thing with me. I saw you in the hallway. I saw your face. I was bringing up towels. You were listening." Around them, the kitchen kept moving. Sophia at the stove, two catering assistants ferrying trays toward the dining room, the low clatter of an enormous house preparing for an enormous party. Nobody was paying attention to the two women near the island, which was exactly how Vanessa liked it. "I have nothing to say," Maya said, and reached for a dish towel folded on the counter, needing something to do with her hands. Vanessa got there first. She snatched the towel, soft linen, monogrammed with a small embroidered A, left over from an older set of the Cross family's things. And before Maya understood what was happening, Vanessa had pressed it hard against her mouth, one hand fisted in Maya's curls to hold her head still, the other pinning the cloth flat. "You listen to me," Vanessa hissed, her public smile gone now, replaced by something Maya had never seen on her before, something ugly and afraid at the same time. "You say one word to Nathaniel, one word, and I will make sure you never work in this city again. I will make sure your son never sees a hospital bill paid by anyone who loves you. Do you understand me?" Maya's eyes burned. Not from pain. Vanessa wasn't hurting her, not really, just holding her, just silencing her, but from the sheer disbelief of it. 34 years old, and she was being handled like a child, like a thing, in a kitchen she had scrubbed and seasoned and loved for 6 years. She grabbed Vanessa's wrist and pulled the towel down enough to breathe. "Get off me. Not until you promise. What in God's name is going on in here?" The voice cut through the kitchen like a dropped plate. Nathaniel Cross stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, tie loosened, a folder of seating charts still in his hand, and for one long frozen second nobody moved. Vanessa's hand was still tangled in Maya's hair. The towel had fallen to the floor between them. Sophia had stopped stirring. The catering assistants had stopped walking. Vanessa recovered first. She always recovered first, dropping her hand and stepping back with a small, startled laugh, already reaching for the smile. "Nathaniel, thank goodness." Maya was choking. "I was not choking," Maya said, her voice shaking now, finally, after holding steady through everything else. Nathaniel's eyes moved from Vanessa's face, still arranging itself into concern, to Maya's, flushed and furious, and trying very hard not to cry in front of 30 pounds of catering staff. He set the folder down slowly on the counter, the way a man sets something down when he needs both hands free and doesn't yet know for what. "Everyone," he said without raising his voice, "give us the room." Nobody needed telling twice. And in the sudden quiet of the empty kitchen, Nathaniel Cross looked at his fiancée of 4 months, the way a man looks at a house he's just realized might be built on sand. "Tell me what I just walked into," he said. "And Vanessa, I want the truth, not the version you tell at dinner parties." Vanessa's smile held. It always held. But something behind her eyes did not. To understand what happened in that kitchen, you have to understand who these three people were before that afternoon. Because none of them had started out where they ended up, and every one of them had a reason for the mask they wore. Maya Bennett had grown up 2 miles from the Cross Estate, in a part of Charleston the tourist maps didn't bother printing, raised by a mother who cleaned other people's houses for 30 years and never once complained about it in front of her daughter. Odessa Bennett had worked for the Cross family back when Nathaniel was a boy. Back when his mother, Eleanor, was still alive, and the house still had laughter in it instead of just money. Maya remembered visiting as a little girl, sitting in the servant's kitchen doing homework while her mother polished silver 2 rooms away. And sometimes a skinny, serious 9-year-old named Nathaniel would wander in and do his homework across the table from her. 2 kids who understood, without ever discussing it, that the big house wasn't really theirs to relax in. Odessa had died 6 years ago. Maya had taken over her position not out of sentiment but out of necessity. She had a son to raise alone, an ex-husband who'd stopped sending checks around the time Eli turned 3, and a 9-year-old boy of her own now with asthma bad enough that a single bad flare could mean an ER bill that ate a month's wages. She kept a photo of her mother in her locker in the staff room. She kept her head down and her work spotless, because spotless work was the only kind of armor a woman in her position got to wear. Nathaniel Cross was 34 years old and had inherited more money than he'd ever asked for, at an age, 26, when most people were still figuring out rent. His father had died of a heart attack in a boardroom. His mother had gone 18 months later, of what the doctors called complications and what everyone privately understood to be grief. Nathaniel had built Cross Industries from a mid-sized real estate firm into a company on the edge of a 9-figure public offering. And he had done it mostly alone. He did not trust easily. The one woman he'd loved before Vanessa had left him 3 days before their wedding for a man with a smaller net worth but, as she'd put it, a version of himself he actually liked. Nathaniel had not forgotten that sentence. He turned it over some nights like a stone in his pocket. Vanessa Hale had been born into money that had quietly run out sometime around her 15th birthday. Though nobody outside her family knew that. Her father's real estate ventures had collapsed one after another, and Vanessa had learned, early and thoroughly, that a smile and the right last name could paper over almost anything, right up until the bill came due. She was 30 years old, striking, magnetic at a party, capable of making a room feel like it existed only for her, and underneath all of it, terrified. Terrified of going back to what her family had actually become. A mother who sold jewelry piece by piece to keep up appearances, a father who took meetings in restaurants he could no longer afford so no one would see the modest apartment they'd moved into after the house went. Vanessa had watched all of it happen at 15. Had watched her mother practice a smile in a mirror before walking into a room where everyone already knew the family was ruined and had simply agreed, silently, collectively, not to say so out loud. She had learned the lesson so thoroughly she no longer experienced it as a lesson at all. It was just how the world worked. You smiled. You performed solvency until you found your way back to it, by whatever door was open. Preston Cross, Nathaniel's own first cousin, a man who had spent a decade quietly resenting that the family company had passed to Nathaniel and not to him. Had known Vanessa's family socially for years, had watched her operate at enough galas and fundraisers to recognize a particular kind of talent when he saw it. When he introduced her to Nathaniel 8 months ago at a hospital charity gala, it hadn't been an accident, and it hadn't been kind. Vanessa had understood within the first 10 minutes of conversation exactly what kind of opportunity she was looking at. A lonely, guarded, enormously wealthy man who hadn't let himself trust anyone in years, standing at the edge of a room he clearly hated being the center of. She also understood, though she wouldn't have put it in these words at the time, exactly what kind of woman Preston needed her to become in order to make his own plans work. She had not understood, not yet, that the opportunity came with a maid who remembered things. Maya had noticed Vanessa's cruelty in small doses long before the kitchen. The way Vanessa spoke to the housekeeping staff as though they were furniture. The way she'd once made a young server cry over a wine stain and then apologized so charmingly to the room that everyone forgot to be angry at her. The way she watched Nathaniel, not with love Maya had come to think, but with the careful attention of someone watching a door she needed to keep unlocked. Nathaniel, for his part, hadn't seen any of it. He was a man who worked 80-hour weeks and came home to a fiancée who greeted him with wine and warmth and never once, in his presence, raised her voice. He didn't see the kitchen. He didn't see the hallways. He saw the woman across the dinner table who made him laugh sometimes, and after years of being alone in a very large, very quiet house, that had been enough to say yes to a ring. It would take one overheard phone call to change that. The weeks before the engagement dinner were, on the surface, some of the busiest and brightest the Cross estate had seen in years. Florists in and out of the East Wing, a wedding planner named Corinne who spoke entirely in exclamation points, Vanessa's face on the society page twice in 1 month, glowing beside Nathaniel at a hospital gala. Underneath the surface, something else was building. Started small. Vanessa began finding fault with Maya in ways that had no real substance. A folded towel set at the wrong angle, a centerpiece an inch too far left, the temperature of coffee brought up a half-degree cool. Small enough that complaining to Nathaniel would have sounded petty. Large enough, repeated daily, to wear a person down. She's been doing this 6 years and suddenly she can't fold a napkin. Sophia muttered one evening, watching Maya redo a table setting for the 3rd time under Vanessa's supervision. "She wants me gone," Maya said quietly, not looking up. "I don't know why. I've barely spoken 2 words to the woman outside of work. Maybe that's exactly why." Maya didn't understand what Sophia meant, not then. It was 2 days later that she got a clearer picture, watching from across the pantry as Vanessa dressed down a young server named Priya over a smudged wine glass. Her voice pitched sweet and reasonable the entire time, the kind of scolding that would have sounded, to anyone walking past the doorway, like gentle correction rather than what it actually was. A woman testing exactly how much a person would swallow before they broke. "I'm not trying to be difficult," Vanessa had said, holding the glass up to the light with theatrical patience. "I just need you to understand that when I ask for perfection, I mean it. Can you understand that, or is that too much to ask?" Priya, 22 years old and 3 semesters from a nursing degree she was paying for 1 catering shift at a time, had nodded and apologized and said nothing else, and Maya had recognized the particular stillness in the girl's shoulders, the stillness of someone doing math in their head about how many more humiliations a paycheck was worth. "She does that to somebody new every week," Sophia said later, scrubbing a pan harder than it needed. "Never the same person twice in a row. Keeps everybody guessing whether they're next." Maya thought about her mother then. About 30 years of you don't hear what you don't hear, baby, and understood for the first time that her mother's silence hadn't been weakness. It had been survival, carefully rationed, spent only on the things that truly mattered. She thought about Eli's inhaler, and the particular blue color of the emergency room waiting chairs, and said nothing either. It was a week after that when she walked past the study and heard Nathaniel's voice, warm in a way she rarely heard it, saying, "You know, my mother used to say Maya's mama had the steadiest hands in Charleston. Best housekeeper this family ever had. Maya's the same, steady. I trust her with things I wouldn't trust half my board with." And Vanessa's voice light and easy. "That's sweet, darling. It's nice you have history with the staff." "History," said the way you'd describe something inconvenient. Something that had outlived its welcome. Maya had kept walking, a stack of folded linens against her chest, and had not let herself think too hard about the tightness in Vanessa's voice on that last word. She had a mortgage-sized hospital bill from Eli's last asthma attack still working its way through a payment plan. She could not afford to have opinions about her employer's fiancé. But 2 nights later, opinions stopped being optional. It was past 11 when Nathaniel asked her to bring a pot of coffee up to the study, where he was working through investor documents ahead of the IPO. Vanessa's suite was down the east hallway, past the small sitting room the family had always called the morning room, though nobody used it in the morning anymore. Maya had the coffee tray balanced carefully, moving quietly out of habit. 6 years of not wanting to disturb a house full of people who could fire her for the sound of a footstep if they were in the wrong mood. She heard Vanessa's voice through the half-open door of the morning room, pitched low, tight with an urgency Maya had never heard from her before. "No, I told you the paperwork has to move before the wedding, not after. Once we're married, there's a joint filing requirement that flags any transfer over a certain threshold, and Nathaniel's lawyers will see it in 12 seconds. Before the wedding, it just looks like an investment restructure." "Preston, are you even listening to me?" Maya stopped walking. The coffee tray trembled very slightly in her hands. "I don't care what he thinks the number should be," Vanessa went on. "I care that the shares move to the holding company before the shareholder vote, or none of this works. And I have wasted 8 months of my life smiling at people I can't stand for nothing." Maya's mouth had gone dry. She should have kept walking. Every instinct her mother had ever taught her. "You don't hear what you don't hear, baby, not in this line of work," screamed at her to keep walking. She kept walking. But she hadn't been quiet enough. The floorboard outside the morning room had always creaked. A small, familiar complaint in old Charleston would that Maya had stepped around out of habit for 6 years without ever thinking about why. That night, carrying a tray she couldn't set down, she stepped on it anyway. The voice inside went silent. Maya didn't wait to see the door open. She walked the rest of the hallway at a normal pace, delivered the coffee to Nathaniel with a steady hand and a, "Will there be anything else, sir?" that came out far calmer than she felt, and made it back to the staff quarters before she let herself shake. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a long time that night, staring at a photograph of her mother on the dresser, and turned the sentence over and over in her mind. The shares moved to the holding company before the shareholder vote, or none of this works. She didn't understand the mechanics of it. She wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a businesswoman, had never sat in a boardroom in her life, but she understood the shape of it well enough. Vanessa was moving something of Nathaniel's, something valuable, somewhere he wasn't meant to notice, before the wedding made it harder to hide. And Preston, Nathaniel's own cousin, a man who came to Sunday dinners and called Nathaniel "cuz," with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, was in on it. She thought about telling him right then. She thought about it every day for the next 2 weeks, watching Nathaniel move through the house with the easy trust of a man who had no reason yet to doubt the woman he'd chosen, watching Vanessa smile at him over breakfast with a warmth Maya now understood was rehearsed. One night, unable to shake it, she found Sophia locking up the kitchen and finally said some of it out loud. Not the specifics, not shares or holding companies, just the shape of her fear. "What would you do," she asked, "if you knew something that could blow somebody's whole life apart, and you weren't even sure you understood it right, and the only person you could tell might not believe you?" Sophia set down her keys and looked at her for a long moment. "Is it about him?" "I don't know. Maybe about both of them." "Then you tell him," Sophia said simply. "Not because you're sure. Because you're his in the way that matters. The way somebody who's watched his house for 6 years is his, more than some fiancé who's been here 8 months. You tell him and you let him decide what to do with it. That's not your job to carry alone." Maya had nodded and meant to do exactly that the very next morning. And then Nathaniel had left before dawn for a 2-week investor roadshow up the East Coast, and the moment slid past her, the way moments do, until there wasn't a private one left before the whole house filled up with caterers and florists and 60 guests arriving to celebrate an engagement Maya now understood was built on something rotten. Every time she got close to finding the words, she thought of Eli. 9 years old, asthmatic, currently thriving in the good public school 2 towns over that Maya could only afford because this job paid slightly better than the ones back home. She thought about Vanessa's whispered promise in the kitchen that would come 3 days before it happened, though Maya didn't know that yet. "I will make sure you never work in this city again." She told herself she would find the right moment. She told herself Nathaniel deserved to hear it privately, carefully, with proof, not as a wild accusation from his maid that could be laughed off as jealousy or confusion. She didn't get to choose the moment. Because on the afternoon of the engagement dinner, the formal one, the one with the mayor's wife and 2 board members and a photographer from the Charleston paper, Vanessa caught Maya's face across the kitchen the second Maya walked in, and understood, with the instant clarity of a woman who has spent her whole life reading rooms for danger, that Maya knew something. She didn't know how much. She didn't know what. But she knew the look on Maya's face wasn't the look of a maid thinking about napkins. And so, an hour before 60 guests were due to arrive to celebrate a love story that was, for one of the 2 people in it, an elaborate act of theft, Vanessa Hale walked into her own engagement kitchen and reached for a linen towel. "Tell me what I just walked into," Nathaniel said again, standing in the empty kitchen, the door swinging shut behind the last of the staff. "And Vanessa, I want the truth, not the version you tell at dinner parties." Vanessa laughed, soft and disbelieving, a hand pressed to her chest. "Nathaniel, you're scaring me. I told you she was choking on something. I panicked." "I was not choking," Maya said again, and this time her voice didn't shake. Something in her had settled, in the second since Nathaniel walked in. A decision made without quite deciding it. "She put a towel over my mouth and told me if I said anything to you, she'd make sure I never worked in this city again." Silence. Vanessa's smile flickered. Just once, just at the edges before she caught it. "That's, Nathaniel, that's insane. Why would I say something like that?" "Say what to me?" Nathaniel's voice had gone very quiet, the way it did in board meetings right before he asked the question nobody wanted to answer. "Maya. Say what to me?" Maya looked at him, really looked, for the first time in 6 years, at the boy she'd once done homework across a table from. Now a man standing in his own kitchen realizing the ground under him might not be solid. "2 weeks ago," she said, "I overheard Miss Hale on the phone in the morning room, talking to someone named Preston about moving shares to a holding company before your wedding. She said it had to happen before the shareholder vote, and before the marriage, because after the marriage there's some kind of joint filing that would flag it to your lawyers." The color left Vanessa's face in one clean motion, like a light switching off. "That is not," she started. "Preston." Nathaniel said the name like it had a bad taste. "My cousin Preston." "Nathaniel, she is lying to you," Vanessa said, and for the first time her careful voice cracked at the edges, real panic showing through the performance. "She's jealous, she's always resented me, she's been trying to come between us since the day we got engaged. I have never once spoken to you outside of pouring your coffee," Maya said, and her calm was more devastating than any accusation could have been. "You know that. And you know I'm not lying, because you put a towel over my mouth an hour ago to make sure I never got the chance to say it." Nathaniel's eyes moved between the 2 women. 6 years of quiet, competent loyalty on one side. For months of warmth he'd let himself believe in on the other. And something in his face closed, the way a door closes when a man finally understands the house he's been living in has a room he's never been allowed to see. "Guests are arriving in 40 minutes, he said finally, and his voice had gone terrifyingly level. "Vanessa, you're going to smile through this dinner exactly the way you smile through everything. And tomorrow morning you and I are going to sit down with my legal team, and you are going to explain to me in detail exactly what your cousin has been asking you to help him do to my company." "Nathaniel, not tonight." He turned to Maya, and something in his face softened. Just barely, just enough. "Maya, go home to your son. I'll have Sophia cover the rest of the evening." "Sir, I can still." "Go home," he said gently now. "You've done more than enough for one day." Maya untied her apron with hands that were finally allowed to shake, and walked out of the kitchen past 60 place settings and 40 minutes of a party that was about to become something none of the guests could have predicted. Behind her, she heard Vanessa's voice drop the last of its performance. "You have no idea what you're doing," Vanessa said, quiet and cold. "You have no idea what you're about to lose." Maya didn't stop walking. But she heard Nathaniel's answer, low and certain. "Follow her down the hall." "I think," he said, "I'm about to find out exactly what I almost lost." The dinner happened. Vanessa smiled through all 6 courses, laughed at the mayor's wife's jokes, let the photographer catch her hand resting on Nathaniel's arm for the paper. And if anyone at that table noticed the particular brittleness behind her eyes, they mistook it for pre-wedding nerves. Nathaniel smiled too when he needed to, and excused himself twice to make calls that had nothing to do with catering. 2 days later, he drove to the small house 2 towns over himself, without calling ahead, and knocked on Maya's door at 7 in the evening while Eli did homework at the kitchen table behind her. "Mr. Cross," Maya said, startled, one hand still on a dish towel of her own. An ordinary one, no monogram, no history of violence in it. "I need 10 minutes, he said. "And I need you to tell me everything from the beginning. Not just what you heard in the morning room. Everything." She let him in. Eli looked up wide-eyed at the man he'd only ever seen in photographs his mother kept but never talked about, and Nathaniel, for a strange, unguarded moment, looked at the boy the way a person looks at a photograph of themselves at that age. "You have his eyes," Maya said quietly before she could stop herself, and then flushed, embarrassed. "Sorry. My mother used to say that about your mama's eyes on you. I don't know why I said it." Nathaniel went very still. "You knew my mother." "My mother worked for your family for 30 years, Mr. Cross. Dessa Bennett. I don't know if you'd remember, you were young, but she used to bring me here. I mean there to the house, and we'd do homework together in the kitchen. You and me. You probably don't remember." Something moved across Nathaniel's face. A door opening on a room he hadn't visited in 20 years. "Odessa," he said slowly. "The kitchen table. You used to help me with long division. You were terrible at it. I was 9. I remember the smell of that kitchen," Nathaniel said, almost to himself. "Cinnamon mostly. And something always simmering on the back burner that nobody was allowed to touch until it was ready. My mother's tomato gravy," Maya said, and laughed despite herself, surprised by how easily it came. "She made a pot of it every Sunday, whether we were at your house or ours. Said a kitchen wasn't a kitchen without something patient cooking in it. She used to slip me a biscuit before dinner. My mother pretended not to notice, but I think she knew. I think she was grateful someone in that house was willing to break the rules a little for me. He shook his head slowly, like a man recalibrating an entire decade of memory in real time. I hadn't thought about any of that in years. It's strange. I built a company, buried both my parents, got engaged twice, and somehow I never once put together that the maid quietly running my kitchen was the daughter of the woman who used to sneak me biscuits. You had a lot on your plate, Maya said gently. I didn't exactly go out of my way to remind you either. It's easier some days to just do the work and go home. Is that why you never said anything? All these years? Maya considered the question honestly before answering. Partly pride, I think. I didn't want you looking at me and seeing my mother's story instead of my own work. And partly, she glanced at Eli, still pretending not to listen, partly I just needed the job to stay simple. The minute it stops being simple, it starts feeling like something I could lose. For a moment, in the strange, awkward warmth of Maya's small kitchen, 20 years fell away, and they weren't a billionaire and his maid. They were just two kids who'd grown up on opposite sides of the same house. Then Nathaniel's face sobered, and the moment closed as gently as it had opened. Maya, I need you to understand something. When my father died, there was a provision in his will, a private one, not part of the public filings, that set aside a small percentage of company shares as a gift to the family of anyone who'd given the Cross family, quote, extraordinary and unrepayable service. My father used to talk about your mother pulling my grandfather out of a car after an accident on Meeting Street, back before I was born. Did she ever tell you that story? Maya's breath caught. She never talked about it. She said it wasn't her place to talk about the family's business. It wasn't ever formally executed. My father died before the paperwork went through, and my mother followed him too soon to finish it. It's been sitting unfiled in an old estate folder for 11 years. I only found out about it myself 2 months ago, when my lawyer was doing IPO due diligence and flagged it as an outstanding liability. A little over 2% of Cross Industries. Left informally to Odessa Bennett or her heirs. Maya sat down slowly at her own kitchen table, next to her son, who had stopped pretending to do homework and was watching with a frank attention only a 9-year-old can manage. 2%, she repeated. 2% of a company about to go public at a valuation somewhere north of $4 billion, Nathaniel said quietly. Maya, I think that's exactly what Vanessa and Preston have been trying to bury. Because an unfiled, unresolved heirs claim sitting on the books right before an IPO doesn't just complicate their scheme. It makes it impossible. Once your claim is public, no shares move anywhere without your signature on the record. Maya stared at him, and for the first time in 6 years of folding towels and polishing silver and swallowing her opinions, she understood with dizzying clarity exactly why a woman like Vanessa Hale had put a hand in her hair and a towel over her mouth in a kitchen she thought no one important would ever hear about. She hadn't just overheard a secret. She was one. The lawyers took 11 days to lay it all out, and when they did, even Nathaniel, who had spent 8 years learning not to be surprised by what people would do for money, sat very still in his own boardroom and said nothing for a long moment. Preston Cross had been quietly buying up smaller shareholder positions for over a year, working through 2 shell entities that traced back, eventually, to a holding company registered in his wife's maiden name. On their own, those shares meant little. But combined with the voting proxy Vanessa was engineering, a standard spousal management agreement that Nathaniel's own legal team had drafted as routine paperwork before a wedding, the kind of thing nobody reads carefully because it's supposed to be a formality, Preston would have controlled enough combined voting power to swing the board seat vote scheduled for the week after the IPO. Enough to install himself as chairman. Enough, eventually, to force Nathaniel out of the company his own father had built. Vanessa's cut, according to the numbers the forensic accountant found, was to be $12 million and a permanent seat on the Philanthropic Foundation board. Respectability, finally, purchased the way her family had always purchased everything at someone else's expense. Preston, for his part, had never once doubted the plan would work. He'd spent a decade watching his uncle build an empire he believed, in some quiet, poisoned corner of himself, should rightfully have passed through his branch of the family instead of Nathaniel's. He was older by 4 years, had an MBA Nathaniel never bothered finishing, and had told himself so many times that he deserved the company more that he'd stopped noticing it wasn't true. When Walter's investigators finally sat him down, he hadn't even bothered denying the broad strokes. He'd simply asked, with the wounded indignation of a man who genuinely believed himself wronged, "Do you have any idea how many years I gave this family before Nathaniel was even old enough to sit in a board meeting?" "That's not the question anyone's asking you, Preston," Walter had told him. "The question is whether you conspired to defraud a public company's shareholders. And the answer, according to 11 months of financial records, is yes." The unfiled 2% belonging to Odessa Bennett's heirs was the single loose thread that could unravel the entire plan, because any court reviewing the spousal proxy agreement post-wedding would also review outstanding estate liabilities, and an unresolved claim, once made public, would freeze all related share transfers pending resolution. Preston's timeline required the wedding and the proxy to close before anyone looked closely enough to find Odessa Bennett's name in an 11-year-old estate folder. Vanessa had found it first. Nathaniel's lawyers, doing routine IPO due diligence, had flagged it 2 months ago and mentioned it to Nathaniel almost in passing, but Vanessa, according to the phone records the investigator pulled, had learned of it 3 weeks before that, from a paralegal at the firm handling the estate work, a young woman Vanessa had cultivated a friendship with at the very gym where she'd first heard the name Cross Industries mentioned in passing. She had known about Maya's mother's claim before Nathaniel did. She had gone looking for Maya specifically, had requested her by name for the household staff assigned to her personal service, not because Maya was competent, though she was, but because Vanessa had wanted to watch her. To see if the daughter knew what the mother had never filed. To see if she was a threat that needed managing before the wedding closed the loop. She didn't grab a towel because she was afraid of a rumor, Nathaniel said quietly, reading the investigator's final report at 2 in the morning, alone in his study. She grabbed a towel because she thought I was about to lose the company, and I didn't even know it. Walter Higgins, his lawyer and one of the only people Nathaniel trusted completely, sat across from him, exhausted. "There's one more thing," Walter said. "The phone call Maya overheard. We pulled Vanessa's records for that date. She wasn't just talking to Preston that night." Nathaniel looked up. She called her mother right after. Recorded voicemail, since her mother didn't pick up. "Want to hear it?" Nathaniel nodded once. The recording was brief, Vanessa's voice thinner than Nathaniel had ever heard it, stripped of its performance. "Mama, I don't know if I can do this anymore. I thought it would just be paperwork. I didn't think there'd be a real person's name on it. There's a little boy, Mama. I keep thinking about the little boy." Nathaniel sat with that for a long time after Walter left. It didn't change what she'd done. It didn't put the towel back in the drawer and used. But it told him finally what kind of woman he'd almost married. Not a monster, which would have been simpler, but someone who had known exactly what she was doing and done it anyway, right up until the moment it became a child's face instead of a number on a spreadsheet. Nathaniel didn't confront Vanessa at the house. He confronted her at the restaurant where he'd proposed. A detail he chose deliberately, a small, private cruelty he allowed himself, the only one, because he needed her to understand exactly what she was losing and exactly why. She was already crying before he said a word, which told him she'd known this was coming for days. "I can explain the timeline," she started. "I can explain." "You can't," he said, and set a folder on the table between them. "Not the full investigation, just enough. The voicemail transcript. The proxy agreement, annotated by his lawyers. A photograph of the towel, taken by the kitchen's security camera, a detail neither of them had known existed until Walter's team pulled the footage 3 days ago. "I don't need you to explain anything, Vanessa. I need you to sign the termination of our engagement effective tonight. And I need you to understand that if you or Preston go anywhere near Maya Bennett or her son again, in any capacity, I will use every resource I have to make sure the two of you spend the next decade explaining yourselves to a judge instead of a gala committee." "Nathaniel, please." Her voice cracked, real this time, no performance left in it. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I got so scared of going back to nothing. You don't know what that's like. You've never had nothing." "You're right," he said, quieter now, and something almost like pity moved through him, gone as fast as it came. "I've never had nothing. But I had a mother who taught me that the measure of a person isn't what they do when things are easy. It's what they do to a woman with a sick kid and a mortgage when they think nobody important is watching." He stood, left the folder on the table, and walked out of the restaurant where he'd once believed, with his whole guarded heart, that he'd finally found someone to build a life with. The story broke in the Charleston paper 4 days later. Not the engagement, not yet, but Preston Cross's abrupt resignation from every committee he sat on, and an unnamed source's account of internal irregularities ahead of the Cross Industries public offering. Vanessa Hale's name appeared in the second-to-last paragraph, described only as a person familiar with the matter. The kind of careful legal phrasing that fooled absolutely no one in a city where everyone had, at some point, watched her smile for a camera on Nathaniel Cross's arm. By the end of the week, the engagement announcement had been quietly pulled from the paper's website. By the end of the month, Vanessa Hale had left Charleston altogether, and the invitations that had once filled her calendar had gone, with a particular speed of high society, entirely silent. Justice, in this case, didn't arrive with handcuffs or headlines. It arrived the way it usually does. Slowly, then all at once, in the shape of doors quietly closing. The shareholder meeting happened on schedule, 3 weeks later, in a room full of people who had spent the last month reading careful, contradictory rumors about what had almost happened to the company they'd invested their futures in. Nathaniel stood at the front of the room, Walter Higgins beside him, and told them the truth. All of it, plainly, without theatrics. The attempted proxy scheme, Preston's resignation, and the ongoing legal proceedings against him. And then, because he believed a company built on his father's name deserved to be built honestly, he told them about Odessa Bennett. 11 years ago, he said, my grandfather's life was saved by a housekeeper named Odessa Bennett, in a car accident most of you have never heard about because my family, out of privacy, never made it public. My father intended to formalize a debt to her family that he never got the chance to finish. I'm finishing it today. He gestured, and Maya, in a navy blue dress that had cost her 3 weeks of careful saving, standing at the back of a boardroom she'd cleaned 100 times but never once been invited to sit in, walked to the front, Eli's small hand tucked, at his own insistence, in hers. This is Maya Bennett, Nathaniel said. Odessa's daughter, and effective this morning, the holder of 2% of Cross Industries. Formalized, filed, and fully vested, with full voting rights, exactly as my father intended 11 years ago. The murmur that ran through the room wasn't outrage. It was, to Nathaniel's quiet relief, something closer to respect. The recognition, in a room full of people who understood exactly what 2% of a soon-to-be $4 billion company meant, that a debt of honor had finally been paid. There was a pause before anyone reacted. The particular pause of a room recalibrating everything it thought it understood about the two people at the front of it. Someone near the back, a junior analyst who hadn't been with the company long enough to know any of the history, leaned over to whisper a question to his neighbor, and the neighbor whispered back the story of the security footage, already half legend, already being told slightly wrong the way these things always are within a month of happening. A board member near the front, an older woman named Constance Ledbetter, who had known Nathaniel's father for 30 years and had sat on the board since before Nathaniel was born, stood slowly and began to clap. It wasn't a large gesture. It didn't need to be. Everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant coming from her. I remember your grandfather's accident, Constance said, not loudly, but the room had gone quiet enough that everyone heard it anyway. I remember Eleanor telling me the story at a dinner party, years before you were born, Nathaniel, about the housekeeper who pulled a man out of a burning car without a second thought for her own safety. I always wondered what became of that debt. I'm glad to see it settled properly, and I'm glad to see it settled in the open, instead of buried in a folder the way it almost stayed. Others followed her lead, the applause spreading unevenly at first and then settling into something steadier. Maya stood very still in the middle of it, Eli's hand tight in hers, tears she hadn't planned on falling anyway, and thought absurdly of her mother polishing silver 2 rooms away from a little boy doing his long division wrong. You would have hated all this attention, Mama, she thought. You always hated a fuss. Later, in the hallway outside, a reporter who'd somehow gotten past security asked her the question that would end up as the headline the next morning. Miss Bennett, is it true your former employer's fiancé physically silenced you the day this all came to light? Maya thought of the towel, of Vanessa's hand in her hair, of the fear in her own chest, 34 years old and made to feel, for one terrible minute, like she had no right to a voice in her own kitchen. It's true, she said simply. But I'm not silent anymore. 6 months later, the Cross mansion smelled different. Not of expensive florists and rehearsed charm, but of something plainer and warmer. Sunday dinner mostly, because Nathaniel had started hosting them again, the way his mother used to, and had insisted, over Maya's initial and very firm objections, that she and Eli come as guests, not staff. I don't know how to sit at that table and not serve it, Maya had told him the first time, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the dining room in her own good dress instead of an apron. Then let Eli teach you, Nathaniel had said, nodding toward her son, who was already 3 chairs down, deep in an argument with Sophia's teenage nephew about which was the best position in baseball, utterly unbothered by marble floors or family history. He seems to have figured it out just fine. Maya had a scholarship fund now, set up quietly and without press, for children of Cross Industries employees dealing with chronic illness. She'd insisted on that being the first thing done with her new position on the board, over the accountant's gentle suggestion that she take some time to consider her priorities first. She hadn't needed time. She'd known her priorities for 34 years. She'd just never had the power to act on them before. Sophia still ran the kitchen, and still teased Maya mercilessly about the day she'd shown up to a board meeting more nervous than she'd ever been folding a single napkin for Vanessa Hale. Grace, the old head housekeeper who'd first trained Maya 6 years ago, had cried. Actually cried, the first time in 20 years anyone had seen it, the day she found out. Preston Cross's legal proceedings were still working their way through the courts, slow and unglamorous, the way real justice usually is. A plea deal in the works, a settlement that would strip him of the shares he'd never had any legitimate claim to in the first place, and according to the last thing Nathaniel had heard, a quiet, permanent exile from every family gathering that mattered. He would keep his name, his last name, the one that still opened doors in this city. He would not keep the company, or the respect, or the easy assumption of belonging he'd spent a lifetime taking for granted. Some sentences, Maya had come to think, didn't need a judge to hand them down. Vanessa Hale, as far as anyone in Charleston could determine, had not been seen in the city since the week the story broke. Someone at a gala mentioned months later that she'd resurfaced in Atlanta working, of all things, an ordinary job, the kind she'd spent her whole life being terrified of ending up in. Maya didn't know if that was true and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't need it to be. Sometimes she thought about the voicemail Nathaniel had told her about, once, quietly. There's a little boy, Mama, I keep thinking about the little boy, and found that she felt less anger about it than she'd expected to. Not forgiveness, exactly. Just the tired, clear-eyed understanding that some people build their whole lives on borrowed ground, and eventually, the ground always asks to be paid back, one way or another. What she felt more often these days wasn't anger at all. It was something closer to astonishment, at how close she'd come to staying quiet forever, at how easily an entire life could have kept turning on a secret she almost let herself swallow, out of fear, out of exhaustion, out of 34 years of believing her voice was smaller than other people's. She thought about that most on the mornings she dropped Eli at school, and a woman in the parking lot, a stranger, someone who recognized her from the newspaper, stopped her to say, quietly, "Thank you for saying something." I don't think I would have had the courage. Maya never quite knew what to say back. She usually just said she hadn't felt courageous at all. She just felt like she had no choice left but the truth. As for Nathaniel, he hadn't rushed anything. Neither had she. But some evenings after Eli had fallen asleep in the guest room, he'd started calling his room, without anyone officially deciding that was allowed. Maya and Nathaniel sat on the back porch of the house her mother had once scrubbed floors in, drinking coffee that neither of them needed anyone to serve, talking about nothing important in the easy, unhurried way of two people who had once done homework across a kitchen table and were, very slowly, finding their way back to something like that. Same simple trust. "You know," Nathaniel said one evening, watching the light go gold over the garden his mother used to keep, "my father always said the truest thing about a person is what they do when they think no one important is watching." Maya thought of the kitchen, a towel, the 6 years of small, invisible loyalties nobody had ever thought to notice, right up until the day one of them changed everything. "I think he was right," she said. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, sitting on a porch she had once only ever cleaned, Maya Bennett let herself believe that the woman who smiled in public and hid something dark had lost, in the end, to the woman who had simply told the truth. Quietly, steadily, in a kitchen where nobody thought her voice mattered at all.